Hi everyone, this lecture is on something called the social determinants of health. Most of you have a health background where you understand that there's pathogens or behaviors that contribute to communicable and chronic diseases. These aspects, these determinants are different from that. These are parts of people's lives where they live, work, play that affect their levels of health and quality of life. These social determinants of health fall into 5 categories. According to the Centers for Disease Control, there is education, economic stability, the natural or built environment where someone lives, works, or plays, social context, and accessibility to healthcare or quality healthcare services. According to the Centers for Disease Control, these 5 social determinants all impact individuals. And so what we're going to look at now is each of the 5 social determinants of health and talk about how they can actually impact someone's level of wellness. The first social determinant of health that we'll discuss is education and access to quality education. So it's very clear that education is correlated to economic stability because the higher level of education someone has, typically the more options they have in their career and the more stable of a career they have. We know that people with a high school diploma tend to have higher health status than those who drop out of high school. We also know that those people with advanced training or college education after high school have a higher level of health and wellness than those people who have a high school education. So the more education someone has, the more likely they are to have a higher level of health status. We know that lower education also impacts reading level. So if someone has a lower education level, they often have lower reading levels. So if the material is written at an 8th or 12th grade reading level and they're reading at a 3rd grade reading level, it makes it impossible for them to understand the material. We also know that people with lower education also use primary healthcare services less frequently. That means they don't have preventative health care. They may not have a primary care provider. Therefore, they're not getting preventative care, they're not taking care of themselves at the same level, and therefore they have higher levels of illness. Another aspect in education is what is the primary language of the people involved. If someone's primary language is not English and all the material is written in English, that also would impact their ability to understand the material. So those are some elements of education and how they affect health status. Next is economic stability. And economic stability, as I said, is related to education because the lower the education level, typically the less economic stability there is, the less job opportunities, the less stable the career. When someone does not have a strong economic stability and they're in a job that is not as stable, they tend to have less insurance, if any, and the cost of care then becomes prohibitive for them. They cannot get care because they cannot afford it. There are a group of people who have health insurance who are very poor. They're on medical assistance. There are people in stable jobs with insurance. But then there's a group of people who are called the working poor, and these are people who are working more than one job or one job, and they just don't have the kind of job that provides strong health insurance, or their job provides no health insurance. And because of that, again, they can't have access to health care. People who have economic issues often live in places where there are food deserts. A food desert is when quality healthy food is too far away for them to get it. They also could be something called food insecure. When someone is food insecure, it means they cannot afford healthy food. So those 2 elements impact someone's health level. If someone is living in a food desert, they are also typically living in an area where there are very few, if any, exercise resources. So there's no place for them to exercise safely, or they can't afford to join a gym membership. And so exercise is not a priority because they just cannot do it. Oftentimes in economic and stable homes, there is no time to exercise. So if we look at the working poor and adults in that household are working more than one job just to have money for food and to pay their bills, they're not as likely to have time to exercise. We know that economically unstable communities have lower maternal child health statistics, which is a major element that people use to determine the overall health of a community. They have higher teen birth rates. They have higher low birth weights. They have higher preterm births and higher STI rates. And if you look at low birth weight and preterm, that should make sense because if they don't have a gynecologist obstetrician and they are not taking advantage of primary care because they cannot afford it, then it would make sense that their births would be less healthy than if they had it. Economic unstable communities or families have higher rates of chronic diseases and higher rates of communicable diseases. They have greater levels of violence, and they typically have issues with drug use in those communities that are economically unstable or where people live in poverty. So these are all critical elements that can affect someone's level of health and wellness. Next, we have natural or built environment, which includes the community and neighborhood where someone lives or works. So we know that people who live in poverty have less stable environments, less healthy environments. They have greater drug and crime violence. So because violence is there and drugs are there, it's more likely to impact their health status. There's often a greater lack of safety in environments where there's poverty. Sometimes the communities do not have access or availability to health and preventative services. So in rural communities and in urban communities, there tends to be fewer healthcare providers available. So people just can't get to them, or there's not enough healthcare providers for them, or there may not be specialists that they need. Typically in rural and urban communities, there are fewer mental health services, and people who live in poverty tend to have higher stress. So if there are fewer health services and mental health services available to them in their community, they can't get to them. Also in this community aspect, you need to think about infrastructure and things like transportation. In rural communities, transportation is a major issue because there is no mass transit. And in urban communities, sometimes mass transit is inefficient or insufficient for people to use it to get what they need. And often in poorer communities, there's poor housing situations. So in older homes, there's lead in the paint and other places, and that lead can lead to issues for children and adults. There's more likely to be roach droppings, which relates to asthma and other respiratory issues. In urban areas, there may be higher rates of pollution, like air pollution. And in rural communities, housing is also sometimes very poor housing conditions in rural communities. All of those elements in the community or the environment then impact a person's level of health or wellness. The next element is social or community context, and this is a huge element because it covers all of society and social aspects of society. This is where racism, sexism, and other prejudices fall. So we know, all the literature is very clear, that minority races are treated poorly compared to the white race in healthcare and in general. If you're a minority and you go into a retail store, you're often treated differently than someone who's white. In healthcare providers also, typically minorities are not taken as seriously as whites. in relation to sex. Men are taken more seriously in healthcare than are women, and minority women are taken less seriously than women are in general. So they may not be able to get the kind of things they need just because of the innate racism that exists in our country. There's other prejudices, for example, of religion or of gender or orientation. So one of the big deals in healthcare is that there's a lack of understanding of the LGBT community. And oftentimes people who are LGBTQ do not go to healthcare facilities because they're not treated well when they go there. Part of that is due to lack of cultural competence of healthcare providers. If healthcare providers are not trained in the cultural competence elements that they need, then they're just not aware that they're even being prejudiced or racist or sexist when they're treating people. So, for example, if a healthcare community is in a Latina community, and the healthcare providers there do not understand the Hispanic culture, they may say and do things that are inappropriate to that culture, which then makes people in that community not want to go to healthcare. There are cultural groups and ethnic groups that believe more in non-traditional medicine, and if healthcare providers are not aware of that, that could be an issue as well. If we talk about the LGBTQ community, there tends to be a huge deficit in healthcare providers' understanding of the people in that community. Oftentimes, for example, healthcare providers assume that lesbians are not at high risk for STIs because they don't have sex with men. However, sometimes lesbians have had sex with men in the past and they may already have an STI. Or if lesbians are participating in sexual activities and they share sex toys within that process that are not cleaned in between each person's use, disease can transmit that way. So just basic understanding of the culture and behaviors of the people within that culture really impacts whether or not people in the culture use healthcare. Another issue in social community context would be communication skills or language barriers, which relates back to education. If the people in your community do not have English as their primary language, but everything is in English, it's going to impact their ability to utilize healthcare services. If people are more engaged in their community and volunteerism, they are more likely to be healthy. However, if you're poor and you're working 2 jobs, it's not likely you're going to be volunteering. And so you may have a disconnect there. And then you may also live in communities that do not support healthy behaviors. So if you live in a community or within a culture that does not promote preventative care, you're less likely to use preventative care. If you live in a community that does not trust healthcare providers because of things that have happened to them personally or in the past, you're not likely to have that community use healthcare. If the community believes in non-traditional medicine, non-traditional related to U.S. medicine, then maybe they're not going to use traditional preventative care in the community. So all of those elements together address whether or not people use primary care or preventative care or any care, and that then affects their health levels tremendously. And the last one is access to quality health care. And there are 2 elements in access, and that is, are the services available and are they accessible? So for example, in a community with a high teen pregnancy rate, there could be a teen clinic that's open Monday through Friday from 9 to 3. The service is available. It's right there. However, that is an example of a service that's not accessible. If you're dealing with teens and you're only open from 9 to 3 Monday through Friday, hopefully the teens are in school. And so even though the service is there, it's not accessible. It may be that it's not accessible because of distance. What if you have a single parent, whether it's a mom or a dad, and they have 3 children, and they need to get the children to pediatricians? And the pediatricians are close, but maybe they're 2 miles away by walking, or maybe they're an hour away by mass transit. it's not realistic to think a single parent is going to take 3 children on a bus or on a walk for an hour or 2 hours to get health care. It's just not likely. And so again, that service is not accessible because people cannot get to it. Could also be true in rural communities where it's not accessible because maybe there's only one vehicle in a family and the person who's working has that vehicle. And if a place is only open during the day and that's when the worker has the car, then there's no way for someone to get to the service. So all of these elements impact it. Another huge impact on access is healthcare insurance. If people do not have insurance, they do not have access to healthcare. Healthcare is way too expensive for people to be able to access it. Another item to consider in access is how many healthcare providers there are. There tend to be fewer healthcare providers in urban and rural areas. So if there are fewer healthcare providers, then maybe they don't have enough healthcare providers to care for everyone. There are fewer services in rural and in urban communities. There are fewer specialists in rural and urban communities. All of those elements impact someone's access to healthcare. So these are the 5 social determinants of health. All of these elements impact an individual's level of health and wellness. As you are thinking about the diseases throughout the semester, I encourage you to think about how each of these social determinants of health impacts the health in relationship to the diseases we're studying. That concludes the lecture. I hope you find it helpful. Please make sure you read the information for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and hopefully you'll find this helpful as you work through the semester.